today's reading from Acts, we are following along with St. Paul's missionary journeys this Lent, and today places us in the context of ancient Greece, specifically in Athens at the Areopagus. Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine the scene. The Areopagus functioned as a place of the elders, much like a Roman Senate, whose members primarily held some sort of public office. And in and around the Areopagus, there were a large group of philosophers just hanging around, talking philosophy. They were primarily Stoics and Epicureans, and they would get together to philosophize and debate with one another. The scriptures tell us that these self-appointed philosophers did nothing but talk about and listen to the latest ideas. There are still some places that are a bit like this today. You may see this on college campuses in and around maybe Washington, D.C., but more often, this kind of discourse happens online these days and on social media. The people there are not necessarily there to discover an end point or truth with a capital T. They're debating. And these discussions and debates, fascinating as they can be, can actually become an end in themselves. This is what the culture was like at the Areopagus in ancient Greece. So Paul is just here. And he notices something in the courtyard where all the statues of the Greek gods were placed. Paul sees a statue with an inscription that says, "To an unknown God." And a light goes off in Paul's head. By having this statue to an unknown God, the Greeks were trying to cover all their bases. While they had a pantheon of gods to worship and revere, they figured there was always the possibility that maybe there's a God out there that they don't know about. Another God who also deserves their worship. And it would be a shame if they left that God out. Maybe that God was an important God. So just in case, they made a statue to honor that God. Now, this Greek unknown God actually reminds me of an ancient mummy I saw in London on display at the British Museum. This particular man, now a mummy, seemingly wasn't totally sure which god or which religion to follow. So he just tried to cover all his bases and was buried with all kinds of various religious tokens, amulets, and symbols of many different gods and different religions. He had Egyptian and pagan, Hebraic, you name it, religious artifacts and symbols all with him in his coffin. Presumably, just in case. Now, it might sound a little bit funny to us, but I don't think our culture is so very different today. Many people are more hesitant than ever to join a particular faith tradition or to commit to one, rather like the mummy guy or even the ancient Athenians. How do we really know which one is right? Aren't they all right in their own way? We have so many unanswered questions. And with so much information out there, so many possibilities, the choices seem endless, and that can become paralyzing. As a reaction to this in our society, some people go to the other extreme and become fundamentalist or absolutely adamant that only they have a corner on the truth. This can lead to extremism, like the embrace of conspiracy theories or narrow concepts about truth, because people want definitive answers in order to make themselves feel more in control and safe in the midst of so much uncertainty. People then divide up into camps of almost opposing realities, and this leads to the problem we have today that Paul also faced, and that Father Mark mentioned in a recent sermon, of a lack of a shared frame of reference, which is, of course, happening all over our world and here in our country, in America. So Paul is trying to offer an alternative, I would say. Paul says, in essence, that the unknown God in that courtyard could actually be known, is knowable, and has made himself known. That God is not only the one true living God, that God is the creator of all of us and has done something really wonderful. God has made sure that those who seek after God can find God, will find God. Paul says, so that each one of us would search for God and perhaps grope for him and find him, though indeed he is not far from each one of us. In other words, God isn't hiding from us. God isn't out of sight or out of reach. God is here with us. God is knowable. God is so knowable, in fact, that Paul says that it is in him that we move and live and have our being. And here Paul is quoting an ancient Greek poet named Epimenides from Crete, demonstrating to the Greeks that their ancestors knew this truth long ago. God has been revealing God's self and God's truth throughout the millennia to people everywhere throughout times. But often the Athenians, like us, were too caught up in either the endless questions resulting in total relativism, or they could become hardened in their absolutism and extreme views, demonizing anyone who doesn't see it their way. But Epimenides was spot on, as Paul describes. Theologian Paul Tillich actually talks about God in a similar way, saying God is the very ground of our being. This concept of God as the ground of our being is something that the mystics across religious traditions have described. And we Christians declare that God has become known to us in the most personal way possible through God's Son in the Incarnation. It is such an amazing fact. It is so incredible and wonderful and mysterious, and yet we might forget about this or even just take it for granted because we've heard it before. Now, I think it's also important to hear what Paul isn't saying in this story. One of the things I love about our tradition in the Episcopal Church and Anglicanism is the fact that we are allowed and even encouraged to ask the hard questions, to search for the truth. And in that search, we're encouraged to bring the wisdom of diverse disciplines and opinions to the table. Not only do we engage the Bible in our faith tradition, but we are encouraged to engage everything from science to philosophy to other faiths and perspectives using our God-given reason, believing that God and God's truth is knowable to all of us. As Anglicans, we affirm that all truth is God's truth, and God's truth can be known and discovered everywhere. Science is not the enemy in this approach, and in fact, science can and has been a great ally. The first scientists were devout Christians, from Copernicus to Galileo to Kepler to Newton, right? I mean, Isaac Newton is so interesting. He was an Anglican. He actually wrote more than 1,000,000 words on the Bible and on theological topics, far more than he wrote on science, just as an example. So notice that Paul, rather than rejecting Greek philosophy outright, as we might expect him to do, actually incorporates it into his dialogue, giving it a place of honor and respect. He affirms that the Greeks too are God's offspring, God's children with whom God cares very deeply. Now, I think this is a wonderful example of our baptismal vow to respect the dignity of every human being, no matter how different they might be from us. This particular story teaches us the value in dialogue that honors the integrity and dignity of the other and the truth present in the other, in acknowledging the divine presence in those coming from different perspectives and belief systems from us. Now, some people have actually said that this portion of Scripture affirms the basis for all Christian interfaith dialogue, which, as you may know, I'm a big fan of, being the appointed ecumenical and interfaith officer for our diocese. The goal of this dialogue, though, is building bridges and deeper understanding with one another. So what if we did this more as a society? We can take then this wonderful gift that God has given us, the gift of being able to seek out and find God, a God who is the ground of our being, who has been made known to us, and to share that with others, not as a basis to exclude or deny the truth found in different perspectives and disciplines, but as a means to engage more deeply in understanding the truth inherent in God's world and revealed to us in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. We don't have to be either relativists or fundamentalists. We can proclaim truth with a capital T and recognize truth in others at the same time. Paul apparently impressed the philosophers of that day because they invited him back. They said, "We will hear from you again." But I can't help but notice that they were also continuing to put off any decision about truth that day, postponing it into the indefinite future. It's as if they were too enamored with the idea of contemplating options with endless debate and dialogue, more than reaching truth. So, what in all this can we bring with us on our Lenten journeys? Paul's philosophical discourse encourages us in faith to know that God has come to us personally, has been made known to us, is here now, and God is the ground of our being, right? God is knowable. So we have something we get to do in response. We get to seek out and search for God. We do that in prayer and by listening for God in Scripture, in our traditions, in the wider world where God's truth has been made known, being open to God's truth wherever it may be made manifest. And that it will include honoring others and listening to those with different perspectives. My friends, the unknown God has been made known to us, to all of us. So may we all share in that amazing reality. Thanks be to God.